My uncle forged my signature to save his failing business, leaving me homeless at 19 with a destroyed credit score. He thought I was just collateral damage until 7 years later, I became his sole executioner. Welcome back to the channel. Before I take you through the darkest winter of my life and the multi-million-dollar legally binding checkmate that followed, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe. If you believe that the best revenge isn't loud or violent, but rather cold, calculated, and executed purely through the power of contracts and capitalism, you are in the right place. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know, where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I read every single one of your comments, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let me tell you how I weaponized Wall Street to destroy the man who threw me to the wolves. My name is Alex. To understand the absolute bone-chilling cruelty of what my uncle did to me, you have to understand exactly how vulnerable I was when he did it. I was 19 years old when my parents were killed in a multi-car collision on the interstate. In the span of a single afternoon, the entire foundation of my world was violently ripped out from under me. I went from being a normal college freshman, worrying about midterms and dorm food, to standing alone in a rain-soaked cemetery, watching two polished wooden caskets being lowered into the damp, unforgiving earth. I was an only child. I had no grandparents left. Standing by that open grave, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the sea of black umbrellas, I felt a kind of isolation so profound it was almost suffocating. It felt like I was floating in a dark ocean with absolutely nothing to hold on to. And then a hand clamped down heavily on my shoulder. It was my father's older brother, my Uncle Richard. Richard was a man who commanded a room simply by walking into it. He was a real estate developer, a man obsessed with appearances. That day, amidst the grief and the mud, he was wearing a pristine charcoal gray cashmere Burberry coat that smelled faintly of expensive cedarwood cologne and wealth. He pulled me into a tight, incredibly warm embrace. I was shivering, soaked to the bone, and I leaned into him, desperately clinging to the only remaining blood relative I had left in the world. "I've got you, Alex," Richard whispered into my ear, his voice thick with what I thought was genuine emotion. "You aren't alone. You hear me? I am the patriarch of this family now. I promise you on your father's grave, I am going to take care of you as if you were my own flesh and blood. You don't have to worry about a single thing." I closed my eyes and wept into his expensive coat. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me. I believed him. I believed every single word. I thought he was my savior. I didn't know that narcissists don't see tragedy as a time for mourning. They see it as an opportunity. They look at a grieving, desperate, trusting 19-year-old kid and they don't see a nephew. They see a remarkably easy target. The manipulation began 3 months after the funeral. The initial shock of my parents' death had faded into a dull, constant ache. I was struggling to keep up with my college classes. My brain was in a fog. That is exactly when Richard called me, asking me to stop by his corporate office downtown to finalize some administrative family business. Richard's office was designed to intimidate and impress. It was on the top floor of a glass and steel high-rise. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany. A heavy antique grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner. The air smelled of expensive scotch and imported leather. When I walked in, Richard was pacing behind his massive desk, a Bluetooth earpiece in his ear, frantically barking orders at someone about a delayed construction permit. He held up a finger, signaling me to sit down in the plush leather chair opposite him. He ended the call, let out a heavy theatrical sigh, and ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Alex, buddy, it is a madhouse today," Richard said, flashing me a warm, apologetic smile. He walked around the desk and patted me on the back. "How are you holding up? Eating okay? Keeping up with school?" "I'm trying, Uncle Richard," I muttered, looking down at my hands. "It's just hard. There's a lot of paperwork with the life insurance in the house. I barely understand half of it." I know," Richard said soothingly, sliding into the chair next to me. He placed a thick, towering stack of legal documents on the desk between us. There were at least 50 pages, covered in dense, microscopic legal jargon. Sticking out from the edges of the pages were little neon yellow post-it notes indicating where signatures were required. That's exactly why I called you in, Richard continued, his voice dripping with paternal reassurance. Your dad was a great man, Alex, but he was a mess with his paperwork. The life insurance company is giving us the runaround. They need a designated familial guarantor on file to release the policy funds into the trust I'm setting up for you. He handed me a heavy, gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. I'm about to jump onto a conference call with some investors in Dubai, so we have to make this quick, he said, checking his Rolex impatiently. Just sign where the yellow sticky notes are. I'll have my legal team notarize and file everything this afternoon. Don't worry your head about all the legal mumbo-jumbo. That's what you have me for. Let Uncle Richard handle the heavy lifting. I looked at the massive stack of paper. I was 19. I was grieving. I was exhausted. And I trusted this man implicitly. He had stood over my father's grave and sworn to protect me. I didn't read a single word. I took the gold pen, flipped to every yellow sticky note, and signed my name. 12 times. I signed away my life with a smile, thanking him for helping me. 8 months later, the bomb dropped. It started with a phone call from an unknown number, then another. Then the thick, threatening envelopes began arriving in my mailbox at my cheap college apartment. They weren't from a life insurance company. They were from a commercial lending bank. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, tearing open a letter stamped with urgent red ink. Notice of default and intent to sue. My eyes scanned the paper, my brain struggling to process the words. It was a commercial loan default notice. The principal amount borrowed was $500,000. It had been taken out by Apex Pinnacle Development, my Uncle Richard's company. But Richard wasn't the only one on the hook. There, printed clearly at the bottom of the document under the section titled Personal Guarantor and Primary Co-Signer, was my name. My uncle hadn't had me sign life insurance paperwork. He had used my pristine, unblemished, blank slate credit profile as a 19-year-old to personally co-sign a $500,000 high-risk commercial loan to inject cash into his failing real estate business. And now his business was defaulting. The bank wasn't just going after his LLC. Because I was the personal guarantor, they were coming after me. My hands began to shake so violently that the paper slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the cheap carpet. A cold, nauseating wave of panic washed over me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my lungs screaming for air. $500,000. I had exactly $400 in my checking account. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to Richard's house. He lived in a sprawling $3 million gated mansion in the suburbs. I bypassed the intercom, waiting for a landscaping truck to leave before slipping through the iron gates. I parked my beat-up sedan in his circular driveway, ran up the sweeping stone steps, and banged my fists against the heavy mahogany front doors. "Uncle Richard!" I screamed, the autumn wind biting through my thin jacket. "Richard, open the door!" The door finally opened. Richard stood there wearing a plush bathrobe, holding a crystal glass of bourbon. The warm golden light of his immaculate, heated foyer spilled out onto the freezing porch. He looked at me, completely unbothered. The warm, paternal uncle from the cemetery was completely gone. The mask had slipped. In his eyes, there was only the cold, dead stare of a reptile evaluating its prey. "Keep your voice down, Alex. You're disturbing the neighbors," Richard said, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. "I just got a letter from the bank," I yelled, holding up the crumpled default notice, my voice cracking with desperation. "A $500,000 loan? You made me a co-signer?" "Richard, they're threatening to garnish whatever money I make. They're going to destroy my credit. Why would you do this to me?" Richard sighed, an expression of profound boredom crossing his face. He leaned against the doorframe. Look, Alex, the market took a downturn. My development project stalled. The LLC is declaring bankruptcy," he said, speaking to me as if explaining a basic math problem to a slow toddler. "I needed a clean credit profile to secure the bridge loan 8 months ago. You had one. We're family. Family helps family. You lied to me, I sobbed, tears of pure betrayal streaming down my face. You told me it was for my dad's life insurance. I'm 19 years old, Richard. This is going to ruin my entire life. I won't be able to rent an apartment. I won't be able to get a student loan. Please, you have to tell the bank it was a mistake. You have to take my name off of it. Richard's eyes narrowed. His posture stiffened, radiating arrogance and cruelty. I can't do that, Alex. You signed the papers. The ink is dry, he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. You need to grow up and learn how the real world works. Business has risks. Sometimes investments go bad. You were just collateral damage. Now get off my porch before I call the police. He stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The loud, definitive thud of the deadbolt locking echoed in the cold air. I stood alone on his porch, trembling, staring at the closed door. I wasn't just broke. I was buried alive under $500,000 of debt that wasn't mine. The man who swore on my father's grave to protect me had meticulously groomed me, manipulated my grief, and sacrificed my entire future just to buy his failing company a few more months of life. Let me pause right here and ask you a question. Have you ever been profoundly betrayed by someone you trusted with your life? Have you ever had a family member look you dead in the eye and show you that their greed is infinitely more important to them than your survival? How did you react when the mask finally slipped? Tell me your story in the comments. We have all encountered a narcissist, and sharing your experience might just help someone else recognize the red flags before they sign on the dotted line. But what Uncle Richard didn't realize when he slammed that door in my face was that he didn't just destroy a naive 19-year-old kid. He forged the weapon of his own ultimate destruction. He introduced me to the ruthless, brutal mechanics of high finance, and I was about to dedicate every waking second of my life to mastering that very same machine just so I could turn the gears against him. There is a terrifying, invisible consequence to financial ruin in America. It doesn't leave bruises on your skin, but it systematically locks every single door to a normal life. Within 3 months of my uncle slamming that heavy oak door in my face, the bank officially moved forward with the default judgments. Because I was 19, working a part-time campus job with zero assets to seize, the bank couldn't extract the $500,000 from me. But they did the next best thing. They nuked my credit score into oblivion. A credit score isn't just a number, it is a societal passport, and my passport was permanently revoked. My score plummeted from a blank, healthy 720 to a catastrophic 410. When the lease on my cheap college apartment ended, I tried to find a new place. I applied for dozens of apartments, from studio walk-ups to basement rooms. Every single landlord ran a background check, saw a $500,000 commercial default judgment, and immediately threw my application in the trash. I tried to take out a small private student loan to pay for my sophomore year. The loan officer actually laughed at me. I had to drop out of college. By December, I was officially homeless. I will never forget my first night sleeping in my car. It was an old, beat-up 2004 Honda Civic. The temperature outside had dropped to 14 degrees. I parked in the back corner of a 24-hour Walmart parking lot, terrified that a security guard or the police would knock on my window. I layered every piece of clothing I owned, 3 t-shirts, 2 hoodies, and a thin winter coat. I curled into a ball on the back seat, my knees pulled to my chest, shivering so violently my teeth chattered loud enough to echo in the quiet cabin. The cold wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Lying in the dark, watching the exhaust from other cars drift across the icy parking lot, I felt completely, utterly invisible. I realized that if I froze to death in that car, my uncle wouldn't shed a single tear. He was probably sleeping in a California king bed in his heated mansion, entirely unbothered by the fact that he had sacrificed his brother's only child to buy himself a few more months of luxury. I spent 4 months living in that Honda Civic. I showered at a cheap local gym. I worked 3 brutal minimum wage cash jobs, bussing tables, washing dishes, and sweeping construction sites. I hoarded every single crumpled dollar bill I earned, stuffing them into a locked metal box in my trunk. But I didn't let the anger consume me. I didn't turn to drugs or alcohol. I turned the burning, white hot hatred in my chest into a hyper focused, singular obsession. Richard had destroyed me using the complex predatory mechanics of high finance and commercial debt. If I was ever going to survive, if I was ever going to look him in the eye again, I had to understand the weapon he used to gut me. When I wasn't working, I spent hours at the public library. I didn't read fiction. I read textbooks on corporate finance, distressed debt acquisition, hedge fund mechanics, and commercial real estate law. I taught myself how to read balance sheets, P&L statements, and SEC filings. I learned how banks offloaded toxic debt for pennies on the dollar to predatory investment firms. I learned how the sharks operated, and I decided I was going to become the apex predator. According to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, derogatory marks like massive defaults remain on your credit report for exactly 7 years. 84 months. That was my timeline. I spent those 84 months grinding in absolute, terrifying silence. By year 3, I had saved enough cash to rent a small, terrible apartment without a credit check, paying a shady landlord 6 months of rent up front. I talked my way into an entry-level, grueling clerical job at a boutique financial analytics firm by memorizing their entire portfolio and ambushing the hiring manager in the lobby. I worked 80-hour weeks. I was the first one in the office and the last one to leave. I absorbed every piece of financial data I could get my hands on. Because I had no social life, no family, and no distractions, I rose through the ranks with terrifying speed. When the 84 months finally expired, my credit report was wiped clean. The default fell off. But the memory of the freezing Honda Civic did not. 7 years after Richard threw me to the wolves, I was no longer a naive 19-year-old kid. I was 26. I was wearing a bespoke navy blue Tom Ford suit. I was sitting behind a massive, sleek glass desk overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I was the youngest managing director at Vanguard Horizon, a ruthless, incredibly lucrative hedge fund that specialized in one very specific, very aggressive sector of Wall Street: distressed debt acquisition. Here is how distressed debt works, explained simply. When a company or a wealthy individual takes out a massive loan from a bank and fails to pay it back, the bank doesn't want to deal with the headache of foreclosing and managing the property. They just want the toxic debt off their books. So they bundle those bad loans and sell them at a massive discount to hedge funds like ours. Once we buy the debt, we own the leverage. We become the sole creditor. We hold the absolute legal right to demand full payment or ruthlessly liquidate the borrower's assets. My entire job was identifying failing companies, buying their debt from the banks for pennies on the dollar, and executing the corporate equivalent of a guillotine drop. I was incredibly good at it because I operated without a single ounce of empathy. One crisp Tuesday morning in November, my lead acquisitions analyst walked into my office and handed me a thick black leather dossier. "Alex," he said, tapping the folder, "we just got a lead on a distressed commercial portfolio from a regional bank in Connecticut. A mid-sized real estate developer has severely overleveraged his assets. He defaulted on 3 commercial bridge loans. The bank is tired of his excuses. They want to offload his paper quietly by the end of the fiscal quarter." I opened the dossier. I skimmed past the balance sheets and the liability projections, my eyes landing directly on the name of the borrowing entity printed at the top of page 4, Apex Pinnacle Development, LLC. My heart stopped. The air in my corner office suddenly felt very thin. I flipped to the collateral section. The developer hadn't just pledged his failing business assets. He was so desperate for cash that he had put up a personal guarantee. He had taken out a massive predatory second mortgage against his primary residence to secure the business loan. I looked at the address of the collateralized property. It was a sprawling, gated mansion in the suburbs. The exact same mansion where, 7 years ago, I had stood on the freezing porch, begging for my life. The borrower was Richard. My uncle was drowning in debt again. But this time, He didn't have a naive 19-year-old nephew to forge into a co-signer. He had gambled his own house, and he had lost. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the name on the paper. The silence in my office was absolute. A slow, cold, terrifyingly peaceful smile spread across my face. Let's break the fourth wall for a second. I stared at that distressed debt portfolio and I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. Have you ever watched the universe deliver a plate of karma so perfectly timed, so flawlessly orchestrated that you thought you were dreaming? If you were sitting in my chair holding the financial execution papers of the man who threw you onto the streets to freeze, what would you do? Would you crush him immediately or would you play with your food before you ate it? Let me know in the comments, because what Richard didn't know, as he sat in his mansion, dodging calls from his bank, was that the bank was about to sell his financial soul to an anonymous corporate entity. Buy it, I said, my voice eerily calm, not looking up from the dossier. My lead analyst, David, blinked in surprise. Alex, we haven't even run the full risk assessment yet. We usually take 3 days to vet a distressed portfolio of this size. I don't need 3 days, I replied, finally looking up. My eyes were locked onto his, completely devoid of hesitation. I know this developer's history. He's a chronic gambler disguised as a businessman. He is over-leveraged, liquid poor, and his collateral is pristine suburban real estate. The bank wants it off their books. Offer them 60 cents on the dollar, all cash. Close it by Friday. Use the Horizon Alpha Shell entity. I want total corporate anonymity. David nodded, sensing the absolute finality in my tone. Understood. Consider it done. When David left the office, I closed the door, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked down at the Manhattan traffic flowing silently below. By Friday afternoon, the wire transfer cleared. Vanguard Horizon, operating under an anonymous LLC, officially owned 100% of Richard's defaulted commercial debt. We owned the paper. We owned the leverage. I was now my uncle's sole legal executioner. The beauty of distressed debt acquisition is the absolute terror of the silence that precedes the strike. When a bank sells a bad loan to a hedge fund, the borrower usually receives a sterile, automated letter informing them that their debt has been transferred to a third-party servicing entity. They rarely know who actually holds the knife over their neck. I knew Richard's psychology intimately. He was a narcissist who operated on delusion. He probably assumed this third-party entity was just another faceless bureaucracy he could stall, sweet-talk, or legally outmaneuver with a few phone calls from his expensive lawyers. He thought he had time. I let him believe that. I didn't send a demand letter immediately. I didn't call. I let the silence stretch for 6 agonizing weeks. I wanted him to relax. I wanted him to feel secure in his sprawling, heated mansion as the winter approached. I waited until the second week of December to instruct my legal team to file the paperwork. We didn't file a request for payment. We bypassed collections entirely because Richard had defaulted over 120 days prior on a collateralized commercial loan. We filed a direct, expedited notice of default and intent to foreclose. The legal mechanism was brutal and swift. The paperwork demanded the immediate full repayment of the $2.2 million principal balance within 10 days. If the funds were not wired in full, we held the legal right to bypass a public auction and immediately seize the collateralized asset, his $3 million primary residence. I knew he didn't have the $2.2 million in liquid cash. His LLC accounts were bone dry. He was trapped. The 10-day grace period expired on December 23rd. The funds did not arrive. On the morning of December 24th, a judge in Connecticut signed the final order of foreclosure. The deed to the mansion was legally transferred to my holding company. Richard didn't own a single brick of his house anymore. He was a squatter living in a building owned by the nephew he had thrown into the freezing snow 7 years ago, and he was throwing a Christmas Eve party. According to the high society whispers I had my analysts monitor, Richard was hosting his annual, lavish Christmas Eve cocktail party. It was his desperate attempt to project an illusion of wealth to his peers, to prove that his development firm wasn't actually sinking. I decided it was the perfect time to deliver the eviction notice in person. It was snowing heavily when my private car pulled up to the imposing iron gates of his estate. The gates were open for the valet service. The mansion was ablaze with warm golden light. A massive, professionally decorated Christmas tree was visible through the towering front windows. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway. I stepped out into the freezing air. I was wearing a tailored wool overcoat, leather gloves, and a silk scarf. I felt the cold, but it didn't pierce me the way it had when I slept in the Honda Civic. I was insulated by power, wealth, and the intoxicating heat of impending justice. I walked past the valet, ignoring his offer to take my coat, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. The foyer was crowded with Connecticut's corporate elite holding champagne flutes and laughing over the sound of a live jazz pianist playing in the living room. I stood in the entryway, scanning the crowd, and then I saw him. Richard was standing near the fireplace, wearing a velvet smoking jacket, holding a crystal glass of bourbon. He was surrounded by a small group of local politicians and bankers, holding court, laughing loudly at his own joke. He looked exactly the same as he had 7 years ago. Arrogant, bloated with unearned confidence, entirely unbothered by the lives he had ruined. I walked directly toward him, the crowd naturally parting for a man who looked like he owned the room. Richard glanced up. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second as his brain struggled to process my face. He recognized the eyes, but he couldn't reconcile the memory of a desperate, sobbing 19-year-old kid with the cold, impeccably dressed Wall Street executive standing before him. "Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the jazz music. The politicians and bankers turned to look at me, sensing the sudden, drastic drop in temperature. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He stepped away from his guests, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He grabbed my arm, trying to pull me toward the hallway. "Alex!" he hissed, his voice a furious, panicked whisper. "What the hell are you doing here? Did you sneak past security? Are you here to beg for money? I told you 7 years ago I am done with you. Get out of my house before I have you arrested." I didn't move. I casually brushed his hand off my expensive coat, looking at him with absolute, clinical disgust. "I'm not here for your money, Richard," I said, my voice calm, level, and loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "I know you don't have any." Richard froze. The nearby guests stopped talking. The silence began to ripple outward from where we stood. "I'm actually here on business," I continued, reaching inside my coat pocket. I pulled out a crisp, heavy legal folder stamped with the county clerk's red seal. I held it out to him. Richard stared at the folder, his hands trembling slightly. "What is that?" "It's an order of foreclosure and an immediate eviction notice," I said smoothly. "You defaulted on a $2.2 million commercial loan. The bank sold your toxic debt to a hedge fund. That hedge fund is called Vanguard Horizon." Richard's face drained of color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He had received the demand letters from Vanguard Horizon. He knew the name. "I am the managing director of Vanguard Horizon," I said, stepping closer, closing the distance until I was looking down into his terrified eyes. "I bought your debt, Richard. I own the paper. And as of yesterday morning, a judge transferred the deed of this property to my holding company." The glass of bourbon slipped from Richard's hand, shattering against the expensive stone hearth. He didn't even flinch. You can't," he stammered, his chest heaving, his arrogance completely shattered. "This is my home. You can't just take my home." I leaned in, ensuring my voice was low, lethal, and perfectly audible. "Look, Richard, the market took a downturn," I said, repeating the exact, agonizing words he had used to condemn me to homelessness 7 years ago. "Business has risks. Sometimes investments go bad." Tears began to pool in his eyes. The guests surrounding us were staring in horrified, silent shock. "You need to grow up and learn how the real world works," I whispered, delivering the final devastating blow. "You are just collateral damage. Now take your guests and get off my property before I call the police." I didn't wait for his response. I turned my back on him, walked through the silent crowd of stunned elites, and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the freezing, snowy night. Let's break the fourth wall one last time. If you were standing in that opulent living room, watching the man who threw you onto the streets to freeze completely collapse under the weight of his own financial arrogance, would you have felt guilty? Or would you have slept better that night than you had in 7 years? Tell me your verdict in the comments. The fallout was rapid and absolute. Richard could not hide his financial ruin after being publicly exposed at his own Christmas party. He and his wife vacated the property 3 days later, moving their belongings into a rented U-Haul truck in the dead of night to avoid the neighbors' stares. His development firm officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 2 months later. Without the illusion of wealth, his elite friends abandoned him. He is currently living in a small, rented apartment in a different state, completely ostracized from the business community he worshipped. As for the mansion, I didn't keep it. It was a monument to his greed. I hired a commercial real estate firm to gut it, stage it, and sell it to a wealthy tech executive from out of state. My fund cleared a healthy 30% profit on the flip, and I took my massive commission check and invested it quietly. Looking back at the 19-year-old kid freezing in the back of a Honda Civic, I realized something profound about survival. When a toxic family member destroys you, they expect you to remain destroyed. They rely on your continued failure to justify their cruelty. Richard called me collateral damage because it was easier than admitting he was a monster. But you are not defined by the situations you are forced into. You are not the credit score they ruined, the house they kicked you out of, or the lies they told about you. The greatest revenge isn't screaming on their porch. The greatest revenge is walking away in absolute silence, educating yourself, and building a life so unshakable, so legally and financially ironclad that they can never, ever touch you again. And if they happen to stumble into your crosshairs along the way, well, business has risks. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of yourself in this, or if you simply appreciate the cold, calculated mechanics of true legal karma, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own resilience. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never sign a document you haven't read. I will see you in the next story.